Alexander Ovechkin missing a game due to injury. Dan Holmi of Locked On Capitals is here to talk about that and how it will affect the Capitals as we head toward the All-Star break. All that and a lot more on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome, everybody, to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast. Gil Martin, so glad you could join us today, and thank you for making Locked On NHL your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Well, whenever we have Washington Capitals news, we turn to the host of Locked On Capitals, Dan Holmi. And unfortunately, Dan, the news out of our nation's capital, not the best, as Alexander Ovechkin missing a game due to injury. Can you fill us in on the latest news about the Great Eight?
So he missed practice due to a maintenance day, is what they initially said, and everyone didn't think a whole lot of it. They just thought they'd give Ovi a practice off, but then it turned out more news started coming in that he was actually going to miss the game. And then after Peter Laviolette spoke of that it is a lower body injury. That's all that's been released so far, but we're hoping that Ovi gets back in the lineup because we all know that he's the captain at the end of the day and the leadership qualities that he brings to this Caps team.
And, they lose to Vegas in Vegas 6-2. How did the team try to adjust to life without Ovi in that game? And do you think that they'll change that approach if he continues to miss time?
Well, you know what they always say, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. And as far as I'm concerned, that can just stay in Vegas forever. I want to forget about that game. But they did a questionable thing as far as I'm concerned. Generally, I have Peter Laviolette's back as far as his decision-making is concerned. But he, instead of shaking up the lineups, decided to plug and play Anthony Mantha, a guy that's been scratched for the last several games. But ultimately, he said that he just wanted to put Mantha on the top line. So not to shake up the rest of the lines. I do not anticipate that happening going forward as they take on the Avalanche next. But in some unfortunate event, if Ovi's not to go, I would not expect to see Anthony Mantha on the top line due to the results of last time.
So how would you like to see them approach it if, again, Ovi has to miss the next game in Colorado?
Listen, I would rather put most anyone on there other than Anthony Mantha. He has been quite deplorable this season. I hear everyone talk about it, from Twitter and YouTube that they got to trade Anthony Mantha. I guess ultimately it remains to be seen I think they would probably do a call-up or something of that nature. As far as healthy scratches, there's not a lot of options to choose from. They have Alexi Protas, who is on the roster. I would ultimately rather go with Protas, I guess, over Anthony Mantha. Both of them have had kind of lukewarm seasons. So at the end of the day, we hope that Ovi comes back, but I would rather drop someone. If Mantha's going to come back, I would put him lower in the lineup and put most anyone in Ovi's spot.
Now, as far as, the line combinations are concerned, that's one thing, but who steps up from a leadership perspective when Ovi is out of the lineup?
So they gave Tom Wilson the A just as a leadership quality. It is my belief that he will be the captain of the Capitals when Ovechkin hangs up the skates at some point. He does have those great leadership qualities that they look for in a leader on an NHL team. And, around the league, he's seen as, kind of a tough guy, a goon, but it's a lot more than that. He brings a lot to the table as far as goal scoring and leadership. And as I spoke about in this podcast or in other podcasts, is the intimidation factor that he brings. When they were playing the Coyotes, two other players were going to mix it up, and all he had to do was skate into the vicinity, and everyone kind of just skated away. So that is, some of the intangibles that Tom Wilson brings up. So to answer your question, I would say that Tom Wilson will be the one that steps up and takes on more of the leadership role.
Now, the Capitals have 4 games before the All-Star break, 3 of them against quality opponents in Colorado, Pittsburgh, and Toronto. How important are these next 4 games in a very competitive battle for playoff position in the Metropolitan Division and the Eastern Conference?
I mean, man, they're so important if you think about it. This team struggled in October and November. They really found their way in December. And since Tom Wilson and Nick Backstrom have returned to this team, they've struggled a little bit with chemistry. They found some chemistry out there with some different lines. But to get this team gelling and going forward now to make a push for the playoffs, these games are what I consider must-win games. And if you take a look at it, they're playing Colorado, Pittsburgh, Toronto, and the Blue Jackets, which I guess are a little bit lower in the standings there. But, you know, a good litmus test or a measuring stick for me is always how a team plays against the best teams. You know, oftentimes I'll hear people say, well, the Caps should be in good shape. They take on the Coyotes next. I don't want to see them do good just against poor teams. I want to see them play well against the best of the best, because ultimately that is who you're going to have to go through if you're going to want to win a Stanley Cup.
As far as the approach is concerned, do you think this team and the coaching staff tries to play any differently in these games if Ovechkin is not available, or even if he is far from 100% and limited?
Well, I do think they'll probably change their approach. Obviously, the setup is to have Ovi set up from his office at the left dot there and have him slam it home. I guess, you know, it's going to remain to be seen. There's a lot of analytics and that kind of thing that go behind it, but I do see the lines shaking up a little bit. At the end of the day, I would rather have Alex Ovechkin out there at 50% than most of any of the other players out there, not to disparage any of the other guys on the team. It's just that kind of quality of a player that he is out there, that I would take him at 50 or 75% than a lot of other players out there.
Trade deadline is about 5-6 weeks away. What do you anticipate the Capitals looking to do as we get closer?
I think the Capitals will ultimately be pretty quiet. If you look at the moves they made during the season, they picked up Sonny Milano from a PTO from the Flames, killed it. Just amazing out there with Backstrom and Wilson, the BMW line, they're calling it out there. And also Nicholas Aube-Kubel, who has been a pleasant acquisition from the Toronto Maple Leafs, you know, kind of brings that fighting power. He also, you know, a physical game, a great goal scorer. But what do they plan on adding before the deadline? A depth defenseman would be ultimately all I would see them adding. They don't have a lot of cap space to deal with. And, you know, obviously the knee-jerk reaction that everyone comes at me with is they should trade Anthony Mantha. But then these same people don't know how trades work. They say you should trade Anthony Mantha for Bo Horvat or Erik Karlsson. And I'm like, where do you live? I mean, he's been a healthy scratch the last several games. Why would anyone want him? So I ultimately think that Mantha will be on this team through the end of the season, at least as a depth piece to have in their back pocket. But if they do make any moves, I see them being a comparable to like a Sonny Milano or Nicholas Aube-Kubel, unless this team really face dives and then they want to pick up someone bigger. Say Ovechkin is out for the long term. But I don't see them making any huge moves.
Dan, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could follow this story, find the podcast, and find you on social media?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter. It's at DanCaps218. You can find the show on Twitter. It's at Locked On Caps. And then, of course, you can find this podcast on YouTube and wherever you find your podcasts.
All right, Dan Holmi of Locked On Capitals, thanks for joining us today. Always a pleasure talking hockey with you.
Thank you, sir.
Today's episode is brought to you by your friends at FanDuel. The NFL playoffs are here. We're really excited about our new sports betting partner for Locked On because they're the #1 sports book in America, FanDuel. And if you're new to FanDuel, that's even better. They have so many great features that make betting on sports fun and easy. New customers join today to get started with $150 in free bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. To sign up at FanDuel.com/locked on, FanDuel has all your favorite bets from the money line to point spreads and player props. Plus, you can even combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. You can check out all the action on the NFC and AFC championship games, plus the latest NHL games as well. It's all on the app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. So football fans, hockey fans, don't miss out. Place your first $5 bet to get $150 in free bets, win or lose, at FanDuel.com/locked on. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NFL.